This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
This is the Talking Animal Law podcast, brought to you every 2 weeks by the UK Centre for Animal Law and hosted by Paula Sparks, Director of A-Law. But it's not just for lawyers, it's for anyone who cares about animals. So no matter who you are, if you want to know more about animal protection, news, ethics and animal law reform, then this is the podcast for you.
Welcome back to the Talking Animal Law podcast. In this episode, I'll be talking with David Blatte, author of a book titled The Vegan Imperative: Why We Must Give Up Meat and Why We Don't. The book explores the imperative for a vegan lifestyle, but also addresses the question of why people don't adopt dietary change, even when possibly persuaded by moral or environmental or health arguments. David himself is a former animal law attorney, and I'll be talking to him about his career in animal law, the type of cases that he was involved with in practice, as well as his own personal journey towards veganism, and of course, the book. Hello, David. Thank you for joining us today to talk about your book.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No, not at all. And I think it will be a book that's really interesting to many of our listeners. So you call it The Vegan Imperative, and essentially you explore a number of the reasons why we should consider a vegan lifestyle, but also some of the reasons why, despite perhaps rationally understanding those reasons, we might not actually take that step. And I just wanted to start by just asking you about one area, because you share a very personal experience in your book about the grief you suffered about the loss of your father. You talk about your experiences being up close and personal with nature as a child. And I wondered to what extent you felt that shaped your own pathway to becoming a vegan.
Yes, I start the book with that story. You know, it's hard to know whether I would have become vegan anyway. You can never tell. But when I was 12, my father died in a car accident. It was very sudden. So you can imagine how painful it was in the aftermath. There was just a lot of suffering, my mother, my sister, myself. But as he said, I was living in nature. And I started to look around, and it dawned on me that the animals were also suffering. You know, it's obvious with deer, if you see a deer hit by the side of the road. I also saw it in the insects, how they try to avoid pain. They try to avoid dying. And I realized we all suffer. And then it dawned on me, you know, why do we have compassion just for humans? Because compassion is about suffering. And from that moment on, I started expanding my compassion to include animals, including insects. Sometime after that, when I was still in my teens, I decided, you know, why am I killing insects? I stopped that. And eventually I made the connection between the food on our plate and the suffering of animals. And that's when I decided to become vegetarian.
Wow. And what also, you know, fascinates me personally, because I was a lawyer in practice before stepping away and joining A-Law, that you practiced as a lawyer for a number of years and actually took on animal cases.
Yes, I started when I graduated law school. I became a public defender, and that's state-appointed attorneys for people who can't afford it, who were charged with a crime.
Right.
And then I burned out on that, and I actually became a high school teacher for a few years. My parents were both teachers. Then I decided to go back into law and set up an animal law practice. I did that in Berkeley, California. And it was eye-opening in some ways. In criminal law, you go into court and you spend all your time in court. And in civil law, it's a whole nother ballgame. It's all about pleadings and paperwork. So it was a learning experience, but I did that for 5 years, pretty much on my own, and had a bunch of just really interesting cases, a diversity of cases.
I mean, it's really interesting. And I think one of the challenges for being an animal lawyer is that it's such an intersectional area. So you have aspects of the criminal law, regulatory law, licensing. How much of a challenge was that for you in practice, trying to develop a specialist knowledge in those areas and apply them in cases relating to animals?
It was very challenging. Literally every case was a learning experience.
Yes.
Because it involved all different areas of law, substantive law. But it was interesting for that reason. And it was really quite a diversity. I actually used my criminal law case, and one of them, I don't write about this in the book, but you remind me of it. I had a client who was charged with animal cruelty because he was a rescuer, and he had maybe 30 animals in his house, and he was overwhelmed. He was actually trying to help them, but he was so overwhelmed, he was creating a public nuisance. He was actually charged with a crime of public nuisance and, I guess, cruelty to animals. And I came in there and I said, look, I'll represent you as long as you promise never to do this again, which is kind of an interesting position to be in, actually defending someone charged with that crime.
Yes.
But the goal was to help the animals. And we actually had a plea deal, and he agreed never to do it again.
Oh, okay.
So that was an interesting case.
And you did other cases as well. You had what we would call doggy death row cases, where you represent dogs who have been subject to dangerous dogs legislation. Do you have the same breed-specific legislation in your state, or is it different, or was it different at the time?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes. So did you have or do you have now breed-specific legislation targeting particular breeds of dogs, or do the dangerous provisions in the legislation apply to all breeds of dog?
Yeah, back then it was all breeds. I'm not sure if they made it specific, but it's all breeds. But what's interesting, what's particularly challenging, in the United States, each state has its own laws.
Yeah.
And in California, when it comes to dangerous dogs, the state legislature allows each county to create its own rules. So there's not a set of rules. This was a big challenge because in one county, they might have a hearing with certain rules. Another county, they'll have different rules. And so it was difficult navigating that. But eventually I became familiar with all the local counties. And they all do have their dog. Every single county has rules governing dangerous dog hearings. And to me, they're pretty draconian. They can pretty much take your dog, and even in what I consider not that dangerous a case, they could hold your dog pending the hearing, and then if you lose, pending the trial. So I actually had some cases where dogs were held by the state for months. I think one time even over a year, and they're isolated because they're considered dangerous.
Yeah.
In my opinion, they're not dangerous. I'm familiar with dogs, and I have a general sense of the situation. But it was very challenging. For the most part, I would try to negotiate a settlement rather than have a hearing where the person would agree to certain restrictions. There were a few cases, though, where I had to challenge it because they wouldn't agree to a compromise. It was very challenging. I don't know if it's the same there, but judges here in California are elected. And when they have a dangerous dog case, and if they were to say, well, the dog's not dangerous, let him go, and the dog bites someone again, that judge might not get reelected. So, the odds are against you from the beginning. I actually had one of the most high profile cases I had was a case, I don't know if you heard about it over there, where a woman who's a lacrosse coach, very popular, she was going into her apartment and her neighbor's dogs attacked and killed her.
I did, yes.
And I spoke to the guardians of the dog. I used the word guardian instead of owner. I spoke to the guardian of the dog, and it seems, and what I inferred was that only one dog had actually done it, and the other dog happened to be there. And nevertheless, they put down the first dog pretty quickly, but the second dog, the guardian wanted to challenge it. And I took on that case, and they clearly violated their own rules. The hearing has to be either, I think, after a certain number of days, but they rushed it. There were clear violations. They should have been given a new hearing. I went in front of a 3-judge panel. I made the case. It was a winning legal case, but they rejected it. And I think it's for that reason. It was so high profile that if they had let this dog go, people would have been outraged, even though, in my opinion, this dog had nothing to do with it and was not a danger.
Yeah, I mean, judges in the UK are not elected, so not subject to those same pressures. And I think, where those pressures probably applies in relation to the elected members of parliament, who obviously face in relation to dangerous dogs legislation the potential backlash when things do go wrong. But interestingly, another difference that I've only noticed recently with the jurisdiction in legal jurisdiction in America and in the UK is you have very different rules, I think, on standing, who's actually entitled to bring a case in public law proceedings. So in the UK, we have very liberal standing rules. And the principle is that if there is illegality in the way in which public bodies are operating, the light should shine on it. But as I understand it, in America and across different states in America, the standing rules are quite tough. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, I can speak to California, which is where I practiced. Well, obviously, or maybe it's not obvious, but animals can't bring a lawsuit. I don't know if it's the same there or not. I'm not familiar with your laws. And you have to be personally injured to bring a lawsuit. However, there's this rule in California called the unfair competition law, and it allows anyone, at the time, it allowed anyone to bring an action against any business that was engaging in an unfair or unlawful practice. Since then, they've restricted it. You actually have to have specific injury from it. For example, if someone is in the same business and another business is violating the law, they can bring standing, but a general person can't. But when I was practicing, we could. So one of my first cases, and really the one in my mind that had the best outcome, was the foie gras case. And it happened when a young man came into my office with this tape. He had made an illegal tape. And the tape was horrendous. On it was the ducks in this foie gras farm, and they were oversized, and their anuses were exposed, and rats were eating them, and they couldn't defend themselves because they were so overweight. It was just horrific. So the first thing I did, this was early in my practice, was decide, did we have standing? And I looked at the law that I just mentioned, and indeed we did have standing because they were violating the criminal code, anti-cruelty statutes. So we did have standing in that particular case. Now, if I would not be able to bring that because there was not specific harm.
Right.
But at the time we did, still we overcame that hurdle. So just to finish it out, the I'm sure it's the same there, but who you end up with as a judge is often determinative in the outcome of the case. And most judges are very conservative. We happened to pick a liberal, open-minded judge, and we had a hearing. They tried to move the case to another jurisdiction, and the judge wouldn't allow it. And I think at that point, they realized that they had some problems, and I'm not exactly sure what happened with them, but we ended up with this great deal. We got the California legislature involved, and the legislature agreed to ban foie gras in California, and the defendants agreed to close up shop. And that was
a good result, isn't it?
Yeah, it was challenged. Subsequent to my leaving law, it was challenged in the upper courts, but it lost, and now it remains law in California, where it's illegal to sell or produce foie gras.
It's so interesting that you talk about this case, and it's one of the cases I know that you mentioned in the book. But in the UK, the production of foie gras would be illegal under the Animal Welfare Act because of the way in which the production methods. And there's been a recent suggestion or proposal that to support this, the government will also ban the import of foie gras products. And there's been some speculation recently that there might be a U-turn from that position, and we may not see that legislation. But I think the thinking is that people should have freedom of choice, which seems to me rather odd when you actually don't produce something because locally you feel that the methods of production are too cruel to allow then imports of the product and people obtain it that way.
Yes, freedom of choice is used when you're not getting your way. You always say you want freedom of choice.
So tell me more about the moral imperative for veganism, because the book sets out some environmental concerns that people now are very tuned into climate change, there are health reasons, but just focusing on the animals. What was your main argument for why people should move to a vegan lifestyle?
Okay, just for background, I did spend a year as executive director of Vegan Action, promoting veganism. And there was a big debate on how to discuss veganism. There still is. In my experience, most people become vegans, at least start, because of health reasons.
Okay.
Nowadays, the environmental reasons are becoming important. For me, it was the ethical reasons. And those are the ones I try to focus on. Those are the most long lasting. You convince someone that it's morally wrong to eat animals and they become vegetarian or vegan, they're less likely to go back. But there are a number of theories, of moral theories. There's Peter Singer, who wrote Animal Liberation, and he uses what's called the utilitarian theory. Then there's Tom Regan, who wrote The Case for Animal Rights. His is more a rights theory. And I talk about those a little, but really over the years, talking with people, I try to be very practical. And when people ask, why am I vegan? Or back then, why I was vegetarian. By the way, I became vegan about 10 years after I became vegetarian, when I learned about the conditions of farmed animals and factory farms. And when people ask me, I basically answer, I don't want to hurt animals. And it's really as simple as that. The moral argument is basically that animals, like humans, suffer. And the reason we have compassion towards humans who are suffering is because of the suffering. And it's no different for animals. The fact that they're animals and we're humans doesn't diminish their suffering. They're still suffering.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to apply compassion to humans and not harm them, I apply compassion to animals and not harm them. I think the biggest problem or challenge, which you mentioned, is that people don't really see a connection between eating animals and harming animals. And that's one of the big challenges.
Yeah, and it was also interesting, I thought, reading in your book about your exposure to Buddhism, because sometimes when I've spoken to people about veganism, I've met criticisms that, this is about the privileged West. This is a new concept, and it doesn't take into account other cultures. But actually, my understanding is, fairly the opposite, actually, that, other cultures have had this embedded within their own theories, for some time.
Yes, it goes back in the East. Hinduism's a vegetarian religion, and that predated the Buddha. The Buddha lived 2,500 years ago. There's a question as to whether the Buddha was a vegetarian, which I could go into if you're interested, but that's a whole nother story I could talk about for hours. But we also have, Gandhi, who lived a very simple life. So he wasn't privileged in that sense. And a lot of people don't know this. He was a vegetarian for most of his life. I think for a short period when he was in the United Kingdom studying law, he started eating meat.
Right.
But I think he regretted that afterwards. And there was one instance, I read his autobiography many years ago, and he was traveling to Calcutta, and he heard that the cows there were being mistreated. So he and his friend decided at that moment not to drink milk. So Gandhi at some point was actually a vegan. So I don't know if that answers the privilege part, but it does have a long history.
Yes. No, I think that's fascinating. I hadn't heard that story before either. What about the reasons why people don't become vegan, even when they become familiar with many of the arguments in favor of it? I know that in the book you talk about this concept of cognitive dissonance as being one of the reasons. I wonder if you can just explain that for any of our listeners who are not familiar with this term.
Yes, I did. I start the introduction to the book with a story of my friend Mike. We're good friends, we're business partners actually. And with my friends, I don't really talk about veganism. They hear it because I talk about it indirectly with other people. So after knowing him, I don't know, maybe 10, 20 years, he said to me out of the blue, "Dave, I've listened to what you said about vegetarianism, and I agree." Pauses, "But I'm still going to eat meat."
Yeah.
So I think about that because he's a compassionate person. He's a kind person. He's a doctor, and I can tell he really cares about his patients. He tries to help people. So that was sort of the inspiration for the book, because there are many books out there that say why vegan, but not many that say why not vegan. Why do people not go vegan? So cognitive dissonance, most people are familiar with it. I think it was labeled in the 1950s. It's when you have two competing attitudes, or you have an attitude that conflicts with a behavior. So for example, you may be a smoker and you enjoy smoking, but you know it's bad for you. This creates a cognitive dissonance, a tension in the mind. And we have to relieve that tension. The bigger the tension, the more we have to relieve it. There are different ways to relieve it. You can abstain from the activity, you can give up smoking. But if you don't want to do that, you have to come up with justifications for the activity. So for smoking, you might say, well, I'll just stop tomorrow, or, well, 1 or 2 cigarettes a day isn't that bad. So there's a term for the cognitive dissonance around meat. It was coined by some psychologists called the meat paradox. So most people enjoy eating meat, but most people don't want to harm animals. So that creates a cognitive dissonance. So one choice is to become vegan, but the other, what I call, there are cognitive dissonance reduction strategies that people use to relieve the tension, which allows them to keep eating meat. So for example, a big one is dissociation. By the time we see meat in the form of a hamburger or something like that, it's really dissociated from the actual animal. We don't see the eyes generally, we don't see the tails. It's just a piece of meat. So you actually don't think of it as an animal. Society helps by putting slaughterhouses, by hiding them. So we're not aware of the process. Another strategy is denying personal responsibility. You may say, well, I'm just one person out of 7 billion. If I continue to eat meat, it's not going to make a difference. That's another strategy. So there are a number of strategies I talk about in the book, and they're all just ways of people relieving the tension that comes from eating meat when on some level they understand that they're causing harm, but they still want to do it.
Now, there's really helpful explanation. And in fact, in the book, you conclude by giving some practical help to people who are trying to make that transition and who may be finding it difficult. I thought that was a really helpful section.
Yeah, I give a few pointers. and I consulted with a nutritionist for this.
Mm-hmm.
One of the pointers, and it's a lot easier now than when I started. When I started, they didn't have all these fake meats. You couldn't go to Burger King and get a vegan burger. So to me, the single most important thing to do is enjoy your food. Make sure you're eating food you enjoy. So if you don't enjoy it, you're just not going to do it. I also recommend, and this varies for different people. Some people will hear about veganism and go vegan immediately. It actually took me a couple of weeks after I went to the presentation on factory farms, but it happened relatively quickly. A lot of people like to go slow, and that's why they have things like meatless Mondays. So maybe wean yourself off one day a week, or maybe even start one meal a week and gradually go that way. I also recommend eating healthy, because if your health starts to deteriorate, you're not going to stick with it. And there are more specific recommendations in that last chapter.
We need to get everyone to read the book. They can find out the specific recommendations.
Exactly.
I would really recommend reading it. I said to you just before the interview, I've read it twice now, and it's a really good read and a really easy read, and also very interesting because you do have these anecdotes based on your own conversations with people and your own experiences, so it actually brings these issues very much to life. So yeah, thank you for writing it.
Yeah, I tried to make it accessible. That was important. I tried to make it read easily. And I started first with a personal account, and then I did the scientific research, but something was missing. And I realized it was just what you said, anecdotes. And I ended up interviewing a bunch of people, vegans, vegetarians, meat eaters, and I tell their stories, and I have quotes thrown in throughout. So hopefully that brings it to life.
No, it really does for me. I thought that was really key to the book. And it was just really nice to go on that journey with you, actually talking to people and trying to understand all the different perspectives. So thank you. And thank you, David, for giving us your time today, coming to talk to us about the book.
Well, my pleasure. And thank you for your work.
Oh, no, thank you. And have a lovely rest of the week.
Okay.
Take care. Thank you.
Yeah.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening from. And if you give us a good review, it will help others to find us. And don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss a show.
Talking Animal Law is sponsored by Goldsmith Chambers Animal Rights Team at www.goldsmithchambers.com. This project has been supported by funding from Animal Charity Evaluators Movement grants. For more information about the work of the UK Centre for Animal Law, please go to www.alaw.org.uk.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's iroarpod.com.